Reid on LMFM.
Well, as you know, 27 people unfortunately got into a small dinghy last week and it ended up in their watery grave in the English Channel. Let's speak to John Lannon, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Doras. Doras is an independent non-governmental organisation working to promote and protect the rights of migrants in Ireland. Good morning to you, John, and thank you indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. And you'd like to hear from the Irish Government in relation to this, and that the Irish Government would use its influence over other countries and call for safe routes of passage for people who are seeking asylum.
Yes, indeed, and good morning. It was devastating to hear the news that 27 men, women and children had tragically lost their lives while trying to cross to safety in Britain. And the response was talk about sea patrols and offshore detention of refugees and putting troops in French beaches. And, you know, we should be better than that here in Europe, we feel. And we're asking the Irish government to voice their opposition to this sort of response. No one should ever feel that their only option for their future is to cross the world's biggest shipping route in a dinghy. You know, people don't make these choices easily, and
it's the worst tragedy ever, but they weren't the first people to die, and they'd have known to some extent the risks. Imagine knowing the risks of getting into a little dinghy on such a big stretch of water. I mean, you really must be desperate. Absolutely,
and this is the case, you know, as you say, they're not the only deaths, and unfortunately we've had thousands of deaths in the Mediterranean Sea, people trying to cross to safety in Europe. We've even had deaths on the Belarus-Polish border as well, with people being pushed back there. There's desperation. There are situations in the world where countries and communities are devastated by war, by conflict, by oppression, and people are taking desperate measures to try to reach safety. And we need to be able to find a fairer, more compassionate and more effective set of solutions for what's happening in the world and in Europe today. And we believe that the only way to save lives in these dangerous routes is to stop people from believing that these journeys are the only way to be able to have their application for protection and asylum heard, whether it's in the UK or in France or anywhere else. And safe pathways or routes need to be provided for people to be able to get to safety and protection.
To provide a different option.
Indeed, yeah, and there are a range of options available. You know, there are programmes that we have some experience of here in Ireland as well, including refugee resettlement, family reunification, and also it is possible to have complementary pathways that provide opportunities for refugees to enter and settle in a country, like, for example, through labour mobility or education programmes or other schemes. And, you know, we find that nowadays, you know, the countries bearing most responsibility for refugee protection have been those that are probably least equipped to do that. Countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Uganda, you know, they're homes to millions of refugees. So Europe can and must do more and be more compassionate and ensure that you know, the people that are seeking asylum who have no other options but to make dangerous, irregular journeys, they are recognised under the 1951 Refugee Convention. They need to be treated fairly and humanely by being granted a fair hearing on the country that they wish to seek protection and asylum in.
Yeah, the French, Dutch and Belgian ministers have been meeting in Calais and they've been looking at some of the issues or steps that you've been speaking about. But they've also been looking at those who charge people to get into these little dinghies, the people smugglers.
Indeed, and again, you know, the desperation that people face trying to survive and trying to keep their children alive in many cases leads them to make decisions that include handing over huge amounts of money to people smugglers. But if governments want to stop people smugglers, you know, they have to create safe routes. They have to remove their trade. It is a difficult, challenging, complex area, but there are solutions that can be put in place, and as long as the desperation exists and people are fleeing from persecution and torture and war and are being resisted and are being blocked and are being met by police violence across Europe, then they will resort to these desperate measures.
We haven't been doing too well at it so far, have we? I mean, you've been working in this area for the last 20 years, I think, John, since the establishment of direct provision in this country. That in itself has been a very questionable way of dealing with people because of our failure to deal with them and people being left in the system for so long. There's an attitude or a suspicion in terms of dealing with people, I think.
Absolutely, yes, and we've heard, talk in Ireland as well as talk in the UK and elsewhere about pull factors to this country. Well, people seeking protection are not choosing from a menu of countries that they'd like to come to. They're fleeing to wherever they can in order to get sanctuary and protection. And as you say, we've been very deficient in this country as well. Direct provision was set up as a temporary measure 21 years ago. We still have people spending years languishing in centres that are unfit for purpose. We've children growing up in direct provision systems and centres. Their formative years are being damaged, very damaged, by the isolation from the rest of society. We've people who've been unable to access education or work. We've people who have been affected very badly from a mental health point of view, bearing in mind that many people are already coming having faced persecution, having faced torture of a physical or psychological nature. We really must do better here as well and end the direct provision system and provide a more humane basis for people seeking international protection in Ireland.
Yeah, and you think of the people who got onto that dinghy. It was one of the last things they did. One of them was a pregnant woman, somebody expecting a child. I think anyway, at least, it was difficult not to draw comparisons with the Omagh bombing. But it's the scale of death and disaster and tragedy. You can't imagine for a second that any of them were economic migrants. No,
indeed. These are all, men and women and with children as well, who've made heartbreaking decisions. They've left everything they know behind, and they've done that to flee war, to flee persecution, to flee violence. They've experienced, untold trauma in their own countries. They've experienced it en route, through Europe, and in their final desperate efforts to get to the UK, in this case, they lost their lives. And it's a tragedy, that shouldn't be happening in Europe. It's happening all too often, as we've said, around the borders of Europe now. Europe is fortifying itself to stop people from entering the country, people who are fleeing from wars that we're often, to some degree complicit in as well. And while trade can continue to happen, while business happens with the rest of the world, people fleeing from these wars and from conflict and persecution are being blocked from entering Europe, even though we have obligations under the 1951 Geneva Convention.
OK, John, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks for talking to us. Pleasure to speak to you. That's John Lannon, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Doras.
Michael Reid on LMFM.